King Cobra fucks Cyrex up, man.
Radio Free Infinite, episode 260. This week, we're going to be talking about some raw black metal. Specifically, a raw black metal band that is so raw, so nasty, it makes whatever trendy, raw, over-the-top cult band you're thinking of look like a bunch of
flat out fucking poo.
In fact, I'm willing to bet that fella doesn't even like them. Because this week, we're talking about Ildjarn. The story of Ildjarn actually starts way back
when the only people that existed were troglodytes.
With a band that you are no doubt familiar with, name of Emperor. In fact, it starts even before that. Depending on your knowledge of the hidden Emperor lore, you might know that Emperor's bassist, Mortis, ended up leaving the band before their first album came out, and essentially ended up inventing dungeon synth as we know it today. But what comparatively fewer people might know is that Mortis was actually the replacement for somebody. You see, Emperor didn't always used to be called Emperor. Before Emperor existed, there was a weird Norwegian death metal band that only did demos, name of Thou Shalt Suffer. What's really cool about these guys is you can actually hear the roots of Emperor existing pretty early in terms of how atmospheric and spooky they are. Like most of the early Norwegian death metal, not black metal, death metal stuff, it doesn't really bear the mark of the influence of those Swedish bands at all. In fact, it sounds a lot more like Autopsy, albeit in a much more wintry and atmospheric form. But helming the bass spot for this early musical output of the collective that would later on become Emperor, we do not have Mortis. We have Ildjarn, who ended up leaving before Thou Shalt Suffer, ended up transitioning into becoming Emperor. And even though both Emperor and Ildjarn play black metal of some variety, it makes sense that Ildjarn would leave before Emperor became a thing. Because his, or depending on the album, their take on black metal, and yes, we will get to the their later on in this episode, is pretty much the exact opposite of where Emperor ended up going. Because while Emperor became famous for being one of the first bands to adopt some really dense orchestration, Ildjarn, in almost all of its manifold forms, plays hyper-primitive black metal, very short songs, usually just based around a couple of pairs of riffs that repeat for ambient effect. A whole bunch of super short micro songs that come together to make albums that have way more tracks than you would expect for a black metal album. In fact, just looking at the track list, you would be forgiven for thinking that Ildjarn play grindcore, but as you no doubt just heard, this music isn't grindcore at all. It is instead ultra-primitive black metal, and this stems back to Ildjarn's demo days. With some super ultra-primitive riffs. Another interesting feature just in the demos is the appearance of a guest vocalist you might not expect. That being Ishan from Emperor, utilizing his original style of vocals, which is a real treat because this is one of the few places you can hear them before he changed his style on Anthems to the Welcome Cross. Here comes that counterpoint riff, ultra primitive, but still paired with the main riff that opened the song. And it actually echoes some of the voices of that initial opening riff, particularly during its tail end. I'm not going to say that Ildjarn songs are particularly complex, but his songwriting is rather subtle, which you can hear in this deconstructive segment right here. The song sort of tears apart what it has built and starts to concentrate on this singular tone before then abruptly but naturally shifting into a much more menacing groove that is typified by the change in bass line. Ildjarn as a songwriter excels at subtly shifting different elements of the music tectonically in order to generate tension and a sense of development in what would otherwise be incredibly minimalist and simple songs. It's actually rather elegant in its own weird, foresty, caveman, black metal sort of way. It's also tempting to accuse old Ildjarn songs of being the same thing, but when you listen closely, they're clearly not, and there's actually a whole lot of variety to the music. Some of the most compelling moments on Ildjarn's demos occur when most of the black metal accoutrement is dropped entirely in favor of the bass being the lead melodic voice, with the guitars acting as sort of a textural encasing, with their fuzzy, repetitive, droning chords wrapping around that bass and drum chord, resulting in a very creepy atmosphere certainly not the standard sort of thing you hear in black metal.
To me, it's beautiful. And if you don't think so, you're a fucking faggot. And I don't want to hear your bullshit, pal.
At other times, every instrument except the bass leaves for some even more sort of eerie ambient tracks. I mean, you would expect Ildjarn to be good at this sort of thing, given that his native instrument, the one he played in Thou Shalt Suffer, was the bass. And wouldn't you know it, he does a darn good job. That bass focus is also probably a big part of why Ildjarn's music is so intensely rhythmic, but I could be reading into that too much. As far as a standard Ildjarn full-length album goes, I would identify 3 LPs as belonging to that category. That being the self-titled album, Forest Poetry, and Strength and Anger. Of these, I'm probably going to talk about Forest Poetry the most, because along with the Der Freisende Norderike compilation, it's the Ildjarn album I've owned the longest, it's the one I'm most familiar with, and fuck you, it's my show, I'll do what I want. But also because in many ways, it is the most standard of the standard Ildjarn albums, and it's the one that really demonstrates a certain sort of magic eye effect that makes Ildjarn so special, where the more you listen to it, the more you start to see things, or I guess in this case, hear things that you might not have noticed were originally present. I've never really been able to get a magic eye painting to work, but I can definitely do some Ildjarn scrying with the best of them. So, Forest Poetry starts out with a song goes like... Standard sort of classically Ildjarn sounding noisy pair of black metal riffs alternating between each other. Then you get to the next song, it goes something like a little more grumbly and crusty sort of raw black metal leading into this set of riffs that honestly sounds like a black metaled up version of a song you might hear on an early 80s Discharge 7-inch. And so you're like, oh, okay, it's a collection of uber short Ildjarn style songs. That's not that strange, but the more you listen to the album, you start to realize that all of these songs are kind of communicating with each other across the course of the disc. It's almost like one long song that just happens to be split up into 30 individual parts. Later on in the album, you might hear a song that really demonstrates Ildjarn's strength of generating compositional tension through minimalism, with a really heavy intro goes like constantly hammering a singular tone before leading into a sort of riff that makes you go, wait a minute. This is like a counterpoint riff to the main riff from the first song on the album. It just took a couple songs for the album to reach that point. That's what I say when I mean the songs are sort of communicating with each other across the entire album. They're all like individualized fragments of a greater whole. Similarly, you get even farther into the album, you run across songs like this one that appear to be sort of a continuation of those kind of crustier, nastier ideas that were introduced on the album's second song. It's actually really cool as this album starts to reveal all of its secrets to you. And
the benefits don't stop there.
Because the further you get into this album, the more interesting new ideas start being introduced. For instance, on the paradoxically titled Cold and Waste, you actually get with some downright warm and almost heartfelt sounding melodies, at least as far as Ildjarn goes, you know, with the raw black metal. I'm not going to say it's happy sounding, but it's a little bit less hostile and a little bit more majestic. There's also re-examinations of that sort of bass-heavy compositional style that first appeared on Ildjarn's demos, with the guitars moving away from that sort of encasing thing they used to do towards a melody that almost kind of gives me kind of an Autopsy vibe. Something to do with how warbly the chords sound. I don't know, it's interesting. It's an interesting point. It does kind of remind me of a melody on one of the Burzum Prison albums. Funnily enough, both of these albums were released around the same time, but I don't even think that Burzum and Ildjarn were even vaguely aware of each other at that point. That's also not the only sort of weird crossover between Burzum and Ildjarn. Those of you who have been on the black metal side of the internet back in like the early 2000s might remember a recording by the name of Seven Harmonies of Unknown Truths being floated as sort of a lost Burzum demo. That's actually an Ildjarn demo that got mislabeled as a Burzum demo for like years and years, which is really weird because there's not a lot of stylistic overlap between the two bands. I think it more has to do with the fact that both of them sound so alienated from standard black metal, and yet at the same time they are both so different from every other type of music label available that I guess you just kind of got to call them black metal. They're both a couple of wacky guys too. I think the deal with Ildjarn is he was so alienated from the random milling about of the human insect hive that he honestly couldn't even be bothered to burn down a church or stab somebody. Speaking of Alienation, that first Ildjarn album, the self-titled one, similar to forest poetry, but even more minimalist and out there sounding. It's not as aggressive or noisy as forest poetry, it's more just like shamanic and trance-inducing. It's still very, very raw. Unlike forest poetry, there's sort of like an island section in the middle of the album where he starts trying out some really weird ideas. Like this combination of a jangly, clean guitar sound with these distorted spikes of guitar chords being played over it, and even some hyper-quiet clean vocals in the background. Or a surprisingly clean-sounding bass line that's sort of struggling to integrate itself into a very dissonant, hanging guitar chord structure. Or a super heavy, super minimalist, ridiculously distorted bass line that exists only with vocals and drums, no guitars at all, resolving its one tone around some very short, almost sort of like proto riffs, not quite actual riffs. And then the next song immediately after those three is a standard Ildjarn track that sort of harkens back to the opening one in terms of being dissonant black metal. All these things happen one after the other because it's Ildjarn and he doesn't give a shit what you think. And if you thought the self-title was alienated and weird sounding, Strength and Anger is going to blow you away, because the opening track on that album, it's one riff, which isn't that unusual for Ildjarn, and not that unusual for black metal. I mean, like Burzum, Von, lots of people have done that, but how many people have done a riff that just has one note in it? That's that true shit, man. But somehow with the vocals and the really engaging texture of the song, it doesn't become boring. Elsewhere on that album, it actually has some of Ildjarn's catchiest sounding riffs. I mean, for Ildjarn, that's downright melodic sounding. It's almost kind of musical, and it has a pretty neat counterpoint riff to go along with it. But the album ends on probably Ildjarn's bleakest note in the entire catalog, with a couple of ambient tracks, both entitled Hate Meditation. Mostly consisting of a series of tones that just kind of gradually morph into each other. It's probably his most amelodic and anti-musical statement. And yet, it kind of fits for an album that started off with a song that had one riff with one note in it for its entire runtime. But more importantly, in terms of the Ildjarn chronology, I believe this was the beginning of his forays into ambient and electronic music, which kind of form the coda of his career and are an interesting sort of exploration in their own right, but also give us a chance to look at something I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Because the first Ildjarn album that's like all electronic landscapes, it's okay. It's got a bunch of songs that
I like. I don't love them. I don't. I like them.
But I vastly prefer the final music I think that Ildjarn ever recorded, which is the Hardanger Vida album. But this album isn't just labeled Ildjarn, it's labeled Ildjarn Nidhogg, because there's another guy collaborating with him on this record named Nidhogg. And he's actually sort of been an intermittent collaborator with Ildjarn almost through the entire band's history. In fact, the very first Ildjarn song I played for your fine folks tonight was an Ildjarn Nidhogg song. Ildjarn Nidhogg material material was sort of like a way for Ildjarn to kind of experiment with some new sounds. A lot of them just being like one-off things that he only tried once. And a lot of them are honestly some of the coolest stuff he ever did. Like Existenzjäger off of the self-titled Ildjarn Nidhogg compilation. It kind of builds off of that sort of warmer melodic tone that he utilized on the song Cold and Waste off of the Forest Poetry album, but he's playing it with this like weird, I don't even know what that is. I think it's a guitar running through a keyboard. Gives it this like eerie synthetic cold sound. Super strange song, but very interesting. He actually did an even larger scale collaboration with Nidhogg and a couple of other guys for another one-off sort of project album entitled Sort Vokter, which had some of his most eerie sounding material. Like, if there was an Ildjarn answer to symphonic black metal, it'd be stuff like this, where it's like an odd reflection of the trendy sort of melodic symphonic black metal stuff at the time, but with that Ildjarn cheese grater bass, and the keyboards being way more shrill and watery than you'd normally expect for this kind of stuff. Another interesting thing about this album is on each track, the members shuffled around which instrument they each played, which results in songs like this one, where it's honestly the closest Ildjarn has ever come to being involved with some pretty normal black metal. Like, it's still weird and alienated sounding, but it's not that far off from something you might hear on like a Graveland demo. Jesus, never thought you'd hear that frame of reference being used to say, hey, this is more normal black metal, you know, a Graveland demo. But there it is. Sort Vokter, really cool stuff. But getting back to the final musical output of Ildjarn, that being the Hardanger Vida collaboration with Nidhogg. This stuff is really unique sounding. It's not quite what people would call dungeon synth nowadays, but I feel like if you like dungeon synth, you'll probably like Hardanger Vida. It's probably the only Ildjarn album that you could unequivocally say is pretty darn happy sounding. And it makes sense because it's heavily nature themed. And if you can glean anything from the few interviews Ildjarn has given about his music, it's that he loves nature and he hates humanity. So it makes sense that an album that has almost no human element to it and is entirely nature themed would be a lot happier sounding, with these long flowing, overlapping consonant melodies. It's Ildjarn. He likes the woods. He hates you.
Do you and your boy need any help with any yard work?
And he had so much fun doing this kind of stuff that he actually made a Hardanger Vida Part 2 with Nidhogg. And this one's a little bit more experimental. As you're hearing right now, it gets almost kind of dancey. It's certainly more like 70s German electronic sounding. According to interviews I've read with the guy, Ildjarn's a big fan of Biosphere. I don't know if that influenced any of the work he did on Hardanger Vida, but the entire Biosphere catalog, particularly the Substrata album, dovetails nicely with where Ildjarn was going with Hardanger Vida. But after that album, he decided to make his exit from the musical scene. Apparently because his 4-track broke and he thought any new music he recorded wouldn't have the same feel to it, which I can understand. You know, I stopped recording demos for a few years after Windows 10 deprecated all of my fucking recording software. So he makes his exit, leaving behind an interesting legacy of some very interesting music that most of you will probably hate.
I don't give a fuck what you think, bitch!
I think Ildjarn's pretty interesting, and I'm not the only one, because there actually is a whole slew of really weird bands that took a whole lot from Ildjarn. Maybe I'll do an episode on some of them someday. But as far as the RFI episode about Ildjarn goes, that's all for now, folks. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening or watching. Whatever you did, I'll see you next time.
Hey, yo, motherfucker, run nigga rigabix nude and sheet. My dick and basketball gives me that welfare.